Good afternoon and welcome to the Fall 2019 semester of Records Management University. We are broadcasting live from Fife Media Studios in historic Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll be getting started in just a moment. My name is Chris Petty, your Dean of Admissions and co-host of RMU, and I have a few housekeeping items for you before we begin. Because of our awesome turnout, we'll need to mute your phones and computer mics to avoid picking up any feedback or noise. If you have a question, please use the chat window located in the bottom right of the screen. I'll be monitoring the chat session and will respond directly, or if relevant to the discussion, we'll have Dean Mitch address it. Over the next few days, you'll receive an email on how to receive a copy of today's recording, as well as other instructions on all things RMU, including credits and certifications. To those wishing to receive credits for RMU, information about them will be handed out at the end of this semester. To our students viewing this on demand, the credits do count just as much as viewing it live, although we do enjoy the live chat discussions. As you know, RMU is certified by the Institute of Certified Records Managers. It is an official credit qualifying course worth 1 certification maintenance point per class towards your recertification. To receive a pre-approval code for ICRM credits from Fife, you'll need to attend all 5 classes live or listen to all of the recorded sessions. If you aren't able to participate in all 5 classes, you can still receive ICRM credits, but you will need to submit your own justification. Additionally, RMU is certified with the Association for Information in Image Management, or AIM. You can receive certified information professional credits from AIM by your participation in the live or recorded sessions. And so, without further ado, I'm handing the wheel over to Mitch Farbstein, our esteemed Dean of RMU. Mitch, take it away.
All right, Chris, thank you very much for the introduction. Always glad to be here. And we are going to get started on our second class of the semester. So this class is, we're small, is there a comprehensive solution for us? And this is the I Hate Records Management semester. I'll explain that a little bit as we go through this. But basically, this semester is based on 5 real implementations of records management in different types of organizations, different sizes, and so on. And one of the things that we run into at Fife is the idea that some organizations, don't know how to really address the fact that they may be smaller, fewer resources, but they still have the same challenges of having a comprehensive solution, which obviously would include physical, electronic records, obviously in multiple formats, whether it's email, Word documents, social media, and they have the same need as a lot of the bigger organizations. And you say, well, it's probably a little bit easier for them because they don't have as much content. But the challenge for most small organizations is they don't have the resources to be able to implement these enterprise-related solutions. So that's the impetus for this semester, and that's what we're talking about in this class in particular in terms of the sizing. Okay, so 10th semester, we're talking about psychiatrists and psychologists, which we all need once in a while in our lives. And if you haven't been on Records Management University, there's always a theme, and you can see the themes that we've done over the last 5 years since we started Records Management University. And we will probably continue down this pike in the future. I think it's good for me because I learned something, but I hope that doing it based on a theme resonates with folks in different ways and maybe makes records management a little bit more interesting. But also, all of these topics have records that were created and stored and are part of the history of the world that needed to be managed in some way. So records management, in terms of what most of the people are chartered with who are attending RMU today and through the semester, have the same challenges that records managers or people who were archivists or stored information for the millenniums had to do as well. Okay, so I need to explain why Dean Mitch hates records management. So this is analysis session 2. So I explained the first time I got analyzed in the last class, and I'm going to go to the second step of this. So the information panopticon, and people are saying, what the heck is that? Okay. Panopticon is really looking at the full scope of things and seeing the interrelationship about them. So a lot of times now, pan vision is a way of looking at, filming or whatever in a circular, a 360-degree angle and recording all of that. There's prisons that have been built based on this. But in the world today, with regard to information, when you look at records, with this multidimensional content, needs to be captured, observed in this panoramic view, is excruciatingly complex and almost impossible to comprehend. And if you just looked at single segments of records management, you looked at email, you look at physical records, they all have, basically specific requirements and specific relationships within that content. But then when you start expanding outside of that, it gets very, very difficult to really track and understand that. So this is an example of panopticon view of information where you have both a hierarchical visibility, a horizontal visibility, and then you add this degree of complexity, which you all know about when we talk about retention disposition, and that's now a third dimension, which is time. And so when you try to combine all of these and you try to combine all the different types of content that you're responsible for, it's a very, very challenging thing to do. So we know the challenge of electronic records: authenticity over time, variety, lots of different formats, and they always change. Complexity, increasingly sophisticated formats like tweets and other social media or ephemeral messages that are here for a moment and then gone. You have the volume. Okay, we're storing more and more information all the time. Obsolescence. How do we get rid of this stuff over time? And how do we make sure that what we have, we can look at in the future? And then user expectations are always evolving and unrelenting. If you look now at what's going on in the privacy laws, you look in terms of transparency, that's adding a different layer of user expectations than what was there 20 years ago, 30 years ago. When you just have physical records, you can manage it in a much different way. So records management, like Medusa, so attractive and intricate, but so dangerous, trying to avoid an ever-recurring nightmare. That's my problem. That's why I hate records management, because when I'm trying to figure out how to put all this stuff and bundle it together and make sense of it, it becomes really a nightmare because it is so complex. Okay, so as the second class of this semester, we're going to talk about, is there a comprehensive solution for a small organization? And to lead us through this today is our therapist du jour, who is Kay Redfield Jameson, born in the USA, and she's still kicking around. And she's a clinical psychologist focused on bipolar disorder. And it's funny because when I was growing up, which is many, many, many years ago, nobody even heard of anything called bipolar. Okay. Nobody heard of anything like tweets. Nobody heard anything like electronic, emails. All right. So today, that's a big issue that people are recognizing and trying to address. So Kay really focused in on this. She was, professor. She's a professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. She's a UCLA graduate in several degrees. She specializes in mood disorders. None of us have different moods. Our moods are all stable, right? Chris?
Always.
Always. There we go. And sure, her really focus was manic depressive illness is a classic text on bipolar disorder. And you can see in the bottom, based on one of her statements, everybody looks at things a little bit differently, and how you control things that are in your way or things you have to get around. And records management is the same thing. How much control do you really have in your program that you have carte blanche to do what you need to do? None of us do. None of us do in our daily lives. And so we have to be able to compromise and balance that out in terms of what truly we can accomplish. But we need to have goals to be able to get to understand what we need to accomplish. And then finally, she, along with many others in her family, were bipolar. So it's hereditary to a certain extent. Okay, so today's malady is depression. Makes sense, right? And I'll let you read it and just make a couple of comments about it. But most people go through a depressed state at some point in their life. It's very natural and it's okay. I think records managers are always depressed. I said depressed. They don't have depression. I think they're depressed because your challenges are so great and you're trying to figure out the best that you can do for your organization. And sometimes you don't have the financial resources, the employee resources, the technology resources, the warehouse resources if you're doing a lot of physical records. So it's tough in looking at all this stuff and trying to get beyond that and not get into a state of, I can't succeed. And so there's 7 ways to cope with depression at work. I don't need to go through all those, but it's a good thing to look at. And sometimes you need to take a mental break. So if you take a mental break, that's what you're doing right now. You're sitting at RMU and you're listening to something. You don't have to do anything but listen. And sometimes that's a good thing. And you have your environment that you have some control over, and you have the ability to be creative in records management. There's no set in stone way of doing records management. You may have general record schedules from the federal government. You may have other things that are concrete and structured that you have to do, but your whole program is not totally structured, and you have some ability to control that and make it your own, let's say. And so the fifth or the next one would be recognizing never getting to the end. You will never get to the end of your program. You will never get to the end of your implementation. Things will always be changing, and you have to be ready to adapt different approaches and create your own. Okay, in terms of how you need to deal with your organization, and a lot of the stuff that we try to exchange with you in Records Management University is based on the experience that we've had with hundreds, if not thousands, of records managers, either implementing solutions with them, for them, or just talking to them at different conferences, local, national, and so on. And we're kind of all in the same situation, trying to figure out how best to do this as best that we can. Okay, so now we'll kind of get a little bit into the topic of today. And as I explained last class, okay, we take it through kind of this psychological analysis approach, where we're going to do an exploration. What's the state of the game right now? We'll take a look at it, analyzing different things of that game, the corrective actions that we probably should take, and the resolution as to getting things implemented the way they probably should be and how they will work. So what is the records management abnormality? Why does the records management abnormality exist? Who can help the organization become records management, quote unquote, normal? What are the available records management analysis protocols? What are the corrective record management actions to be taken? And how is the records management patient progressing? How are you doing with some of these interventions, I'll call it, during this process? So yeah, the psychoanalysis, the impossible profession, I will change that to records management, the impossible profession by Dean Mitch.
I like that, Mitch.
You like that? All right. It is the impossible profession, I can guarantee you. All right, moving on. So today's records management scenario. We're going to go through the exploration first. Okay, so this organization, small organization, has about 200 employees. If I said, raise your hand if you're an organization of 500 or less or 1,000 or less, unfortunately that doesn't help us because you can't see you raise your hand. But I'm going to assume there's a good percentage of you that are part of a small organization that are challenged with implementing a records management system. And there's larger people from larger organizations that are here, but they may have departments, they may have groups, areas within the organization that they're chartered with maintaining the records. So that's also sometimes a challenge, because if you don't have a global dictate of how everybody should do their records, you have some conflicting things that are going on because this department does it this way and another department does it another way. So if you are part of a big organization, you can still benefit from this, because we're going to be looking at how to address a smaller group of people, but it may be part of a bigger group. It's a federal agency of the Department of Interior. They're down in DC. promotes U.S. building access based on ADA. ADA is the American Disabilities Act. So what they do is, let's say you have a post office, a U.S. post office, you have a federal building. What they do is they are responsible for managing the complaints, and if somebody didn't have a ramp, okay, wheelchair ramp, or in terms of one of these agencies needs to build a new building, they need their design to be reviewed to make sure that handicap or physically disabled people can access the building. They also look at things like applications. When applications, it's called 508 compliance, when applications need to be able to have screen readers on them, or blind people can participate in the activity, and so they look at that too. So they're getting complaints pretty regularly that they have to track. If they need to follow various OMB, Office of Management and Budget records memorandums. If you're in the federal space, you've seen some of these. If you're in the commercial space, they're just basically directives, somewhat from the President of the United States, somewhat from the OMB agency, and somewhat with OMB working with NARA, which is the National Archives. One of the other things they needed to do is adhere to the NARA guidelines in terms of managing the records. If you're in the federal government, if you're submitting what they call file plans or record schedules that indicate disposition, retention, categories, capstone, if you're familiar with that, NARA kind of does a stamp of approval for that, and sometimes you have to go back and forth with NARA over a period of time to get your kind of records, your file plan, your record schedule set up. Now, there's a federal record schedule that NARA manages as well, which is adopted by a lot of the federal agencies, but there's so much detail in that, a lot of it's still applicable to the commercial space as well. So if you're trying to ramp up your records management environment and you're still not comfortable with all the different categories that you may have, the ones that relate to, let's say, HR, financial, et cetera, are going to be similar, whether it's in the federal government or it's in the commercial world. So you can kind of inherit some of those without trying to figure all of them out yourself. The biggest challenge is the schedule is huge, all right? I don't even remember the number of different categories, disposition schedules, and everything else, but you would whittle that down. You wouldn't try to implement the whole thing. The other thing that they required were metrics using dynamic and static reporting. And what I mean by dynamic and static reporting, dynamic things are like, what would you call them, Chris? Dashboards.
Dashboards, yes.
Okay. Dashboards are becoming more and more popular, especially with management. They don't want to read reports. They want to go and look at the dashboard. And let's say that dashboard, being dynamic, it changes on the fly. So they would look at it at that moment in time. They're in a meeting. They want to see how many records are currently on hold or legal hold, and then drill down through that dashboard and see what comprises that slice of the pie, that bar graph, whatever it may be, or a heat map where that information is presented. So it's a great visual tool, and for certain individuals, the visual element is more important than the printed report. And then the other side of it is the static report. So the static report gives you, if you look at, you take a spreadsheet and you print it out, that's what a static report would look like. Now that static report has some great importance because you may want to save that static report as a record. And so the system, as it's generating the static report from the data in the database, maybe even the content that's behind that, you want to potentially save that as a record in the system. And then the seventh one is they were interested in the DoD 5015.02, JITC certification. For them, it was not required because they're not a DoD entity. They're not an intelligence community entity. But they preferred to do that because that gave them the comfort level that some outside organization, which is JITC, the Joint Interoperability Testing Command down in Fort Huachuca, That's a tough word, and it's spelled very strange. Starts with an H, and they're down near. They're actually in Arizona, down near a little bit south of Phoenix. Anyway, they do this kind of testing. The vendors go through, and there's a list. So if you're ever interested in seeing what vendors are on the list, you can just go to the JITIC site, put in DoD 5015.02, and you can see it. And they do continuing testing, perpetual testing on vendors' products to make sure it's doing basically what it's needed to do. And for a lot of the government agencies that are not, and even commercial agencies, we see this all the time, that are not controlled and have to do this, they like to do this because it's a check mark. It says, yes, somebody else has really validated this solution. Okay. Okay, so we'll get into the analysis section. I'm taking a quick drink. Chris, anything on the board that I need to know? Nope. Yep.
No questions thus far. A couple folks have said sometimes the audio cuts in and out a little bit.
Oh, does it?
But
Okay.
it doesn't seem to be an issue now. So if that happens, bear with us just a moment. Sometimes it's just a connection.
Yeah, sometimes I fall asleep.
Mitch is not asleep. I will guarantee you that.
All right. Yeah, please let us know, because we hear it very clearly in our studio up north here, but as it's transmitted, we're not really sure what you're hearing. Okay, so let us know. Okay, so we'll look at the analysis part of this. So in their particular group, okay, they had a records manager with cross-agency responsibilities. What I mean by that is they're the records manager, but they're also doing other things. They're also doing policy. They're doing other employee-related stuff. And what we find is, in small organizations in particular, that the records manager is just not doing records management. So they get stretched very, very quickly. And the challenge, as I kind of implied at the beginning, the complexity of this, you almost need to be fully engaged in records management all the time, especially if it's the initial implementation of, let's say, an electronic system, a new physical system, trying to coordinate the emails and determining, what are we going to do with it if it's capstone. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of resources. And a lot of it is cajoling all the different departments in your organization to pay attention to this. Now, the idea is, with the modern technology, that the individuals or the employees don't really pay much attention to records management, because they're not going to, and to try to convince them that, this is more important than the other things of their job, you're not going to be very successful. So that's the whole thing about, don't get depressed because nobody's listening to you, okay? They don't want to listen to you. They don't want to do it themselves. They don't do it in their home. You go to somebody's home and you look at the, all the stuff that's on somebody's desk, the bills, the mailings, everything else. Nobody's records managing that stuff in general. There are some fanatics that are out there that, they will do that.
Gene, Mitch, you don't categorize your mail?
No. I mean, I categorize my toys. I think that's about it. These are round toys. These are, anyhow, where are my children? I categorize my children, yeah. Actually, my 37 children. But anyway, so the records managers, when their focus is always changing, it becomes very difficult. And it really doesn't leave them much time to participate in things like Records Management University or the Army National Convention and things. So they're not exposed to new things that they need to be aware of. So that's one of the challenges, and in particular with this small organization of 200 people. They have few technical resources, and they have one or two people in IT that pay them a little bit of attention, but that's kind of it. So when you think of all the things that you have to records manage, that's not a lot of support in terms of your efforts. And I think that's why we see that a lot of these organizations are tending to gravitate towards the cloud implementations. It makes it a lot simpler. You kind of delegate the responsibility for the database. You delegate the responsibility for storage and managing and watching that to the vendor who has supplied this, or the cloud provider who has supplied this. And it's not a bad approach. And we're seeing more and more of organizations moving in that direction, even organizations that have implemented systems like this organization implemented it in one cloud, and we moved to the federal cloud or a different cloud later on because the requirements had changed in terms of certifications. And it's easily done, and you don't have to have the internal resources to do that.
Well, and you're also saying that the improved security around
Yeah.
the cloud, you're seeing a lot more customers, a lot more of those companies and government customers that are comfortable being in the cloud because of the
No.
security
Yeah.
protocols.
And typically this isn't necessarily their first application. When they go to the cloud, a lot of times, we talk a little bit more about this as they go through this, they decided to move things like, Word and spreadsheets in Amazon's, in Azure, which is owned by Microsoft, and Microsoft pumped all their applications up into the cloud, and now they call it 365. So it includes email, includes Word, PowerPoint, and a bunch of millions of other things that Microsoft owns. And it gives you access to a lot more applications than you had before, except it's always on a subscription basis. And you have to be connected to the cloud to do most of your work. Okay, so it's a little different approach, but it depends on your organization, and it depends on the security you're looking for. And some people just like we do. We like to have cash in hand. Some people just like to have their technology in hand,
Right.
and not worry, and think of, it's under my mattress. I know where it is. It's not in the bank, and I don't know where it is.
Right.
Okay. Needed a hosted Fed, a cloud FedRAMP environment. FedRAMP is really a qualifier for the type of security, the type of management, and the documentation that's required to talk about their policies, their downtime, et cetera, et cetera. So in a FedRAMP environment, obviously it has to do with the federal environment, there's all these constraints in terms of applications running in the FedRAMP environment. Required a complaint management solution producing records. Okay, so this was the main impetus that was there when they started talking to Fife. Okay, they wanted a process where the individuals go to these buildings. Okay, the public goes to these buildings and they find something wrong about the access, and so they needed to be able to complain about that. And I think in the past, before this, on spreadsheets. I don't remember the exact story. Maybe you remember, Chris?
It's before my time at Fife, actually.
Okay, yeah. Okay. You've been here 100 years. What are you talking about?
You're right.
So they needed a system to do that, but obviously they recognized the fact is they need to save these records that the complaint management system was generating. So they decided that they wanted both at the same time. And by the way, they also were thinking about SharePoint. They decided, maybe that's not for them. It was kind of expensive. So the decision was, I need a document management system as well. So they were looking for this quote unquote comprehensive solution that would be easy to implement, easy for this one-time person to take care of and participate in. And so that's why they started moving forward. So they had several file shares with unstructured filings. Basically, there, it could be a spreadsheet, it could be a Word document, a PDF. And so, like most people have done over the years, everybody has a spot, they load their stuff in it. Nobody remembers how much stuff that they loaded. People leave, people go, and then years later, there's still stuff out there. Well, obviously, it's not being records managed. Nobody knows what the disposition schedule should be because nobody's ever categorized this stuff. So they had a lot of those kind of files around, and they didn't have, with this one individual, the ability to go back into all these files and try to figure that out. And then they basically wanted to capture emails, e-content, which are the Word, the PDFs, et cetera, and the complaint records. They didn't want to print out the complaint records, scan the complaint records in, and save them as records. They wanted to be kind of transparent, so when the complaint session or review is over, and sometimes it takes 2 or 3 years to go through the whole complaint process, and they needed to freeze certain supporting documents, then at the end of that process, the whole thing becomes a record, and it's automatically inserted into the records management system with the right category and disposition schedule, etc. Auto-categorization was important to them because they had very few record resources that can take care of it. And as you may have noticed, or I have noticed very frequently, individuals are not going to categorize their emails, and there are systems based on that. Sometimes it's necessary in certain, what do I want to say, classified environments and so on. But in general, the users are not going to do it, and you're not going to do it. Nobody's going to do it for them, okay? And so what they want is this notion of auto-categorization where content is ingested into the records management system, and as it's coming in, it interprets based on the metadata or the indexing values, which would be the to, the froms, the subject line, or some other markings within that document, okay, or the other properties associated with that email, let's say, or Word document, and then look at the content within, the text within, or within the attachment, and let the system make a decision as to what is the category. And it's not 100%. It all depends on the kind of content you're putting into the system. But the relationship between the cost and effort versus a miscategorization, you're probably going to go with the production of the individuals and not worry too much if you miscategorize something, because if you get the full text of it at the same time, you can always search on the full text. It doesn't have to be by the category.
And also, if you're having people go in there and do sort of the manual categorization, there's still the human error element there as well. So things could be miscategorized with people doing it as well.
Absolutely. If Chris goes in there and says this is an HR document, I'm probably going to say it's an HR document. If he says it's a review, I may or may not say it's a review. I may say it's something else. And so that's the challenge. So the system sometimes is better and more consistent in terms of declaring the category. And then the eighth one is needs to implement the federal GRS schedule. We talked about that a little bit, a few minutes ago. And, it's easy when you have an automated system because you don't want anybody sitting there keying this thing in. It's huge. So you basically download it, you add it to the system, and then you can say, okay, I'm going to use all these categories and all these disposition schedules, or I only want to do a select number of them because I'm doing this kind of, I mentioned this before, this big bucket approach that I don't want to get too granular because more granularity means the system's going to have a harder time to differentiate this sub category with this sub category. And you don't really need to do that. And this is important in making the assessment when you're creating either the policy or records management system or just trying to implement it. You've got to think about how granular you want to be, how far down the hierarchy you want to go, and how necessary is it in finding those records, and how important is it that your categories are exactly correct. All right. And that also goes with disposition, because what we see is, particularly for like email, you don't want to have 10 degrees of or 30 degrees of email granularity with regards to categories. A lot of people have gone to 3 years, 7 years, permanent, or something or about like that. Okay. And that's what your focus should start being. Make it less granular. It'll be much easier to manage and control. Okay, so that was the basic analysis of what they were trying to do and what they needed. So then we got into the corrective actions. What are we going to do to help implement this combination of a complaint management system and email? The good news is they weren't really needing physical records. They didn't have a lot of physical records. And if you look at where most organizations are going, people are absolutely getting away from physical records, but most organizations still have physical records, and they're going to be around for a while. So the corrective actions here were mainly on the electronic side. Okay, design system based on third-party recommending records management consulting team. So we run into this a lot. Fife is not, I wouldn't say is a records management consulting company. Okay, we don't typically go on site with our prospects, customers, and help them design. What categories they should have, and how they want to manage some of this when it's sitting in somebody's file drawer, and how do you get it out of the file drawer, and how do you get it into, either get it scanned or put it into a warehouse. So we let the third parties do that because that's what they do every day. We're software, they're really the consulting side of it. But we have the experience to help guide, but we don't have the resources to sit with you. And so there are a lot of consulting firms out there that have this kind of experience. And if you're new to the game, or you're really just a wholesale sweep out of what you've been doing in the past and bringing in something new, it's worth it to get some of these consultants in and help you. So a lot of times we interact with the consultants, and in this particular case, that's what they were using, and it helped to accelerate the implementation of the system. Phased approach for complaint records, email, and document management. So, where do they start? Like I mentioned earlier, they wanted to start with the complaint system because that was the most important thing. That's what they had needed to get under control. And then, it was their decision whether they wanted to concentrate on email, on other electronic records. And they also had, as I mentioned before, a need for document management. Now, if you look at how to build a great records management system, the one thing that you need in that equation is a great document management system. Okay, and to differentiate between the two, document management is really the front end creation. If you have SharePoint or you have standalone Word document applications, you have Excel spreadsheets, you have PDFs. At that point, you are creating this. That's the document management component of this, and you are creating content. You don't necessarily create content in your records management system because the records management system is really supposed to have immutable objects being stored, things that are not changing. Now, you can make a new version of a record, but it becomes a different record at that point. You're not changing the original record, where in document management, let's say you take a Word document, you are changing that. You are editing it, you're sharing it, you're updating it, and then at some point it's declared a record. But this always goes back to the most interesting question I typically ask people: when does a record become a record? And I don't get very clear answers to that from a consistent point of view of the records managers. It's all over the place. So that's one of the declarations that you have to make early on in the game as it relates to document management. But if you have a good document management system, the stuff could just flow into the records solution, and the categories have already been set. It's you know where they are, you know where the documents live. Like in a file share, that's not a document management solution. It's just files sitting out there on a drive somewhere. But document management, like a SharePoint system, would be a document management system. Created a custom public-facing complaint solution, auto-feeding the record system. This gave them the ability to control not only the registration of the complaint, but the whole workflow process of addressing the complaint. And you're addressing it, let's say, as a case. And each case has to be reviewed. Other documents that have been submitted by the complaintee, or other things that took place in the past precedent type records, can be added to this kind of collection, and that can be reviewed in total while it's going through a business process. And so that was something that they really needed, and they could take the same workflow engine that would have been applied, and that is applied to records management, to that complaint solution as well. So you have basically one engine that's controlling both the complaint management side of it as well as the record side of it. You're hearing a lot of stuff, I'm thinking, because I'm hearing it, about privacy and what you have as rights, not just as records manager, but just as the public. rights to your information. It's a very complex thing that has been imposed on society right now, and it's very costly. And if you haven't been dragged into this whole notion of privacy and sustaining the records that have private information in them, then I'm surprised. You will be, okay? And records management is very, very challenging. Privacy is even more challenging because if you don't have the records, you don't know where the private information is. And the private information lives in databases on somebody's PC. It's physical records, it's electronic records, very, very complex. And in a future class, I'm not sure we can do it this semester because it is so detailed, we'll talk about privacy and how the industry is addressing it from a vendor perspective and how the public is addressing it as well as commercial and government.
Yeah, I was actually just looking at the new iPhone, and one of the reasons I was looking at it is because it's supposed to emphasize some more privacy capabilities
And
than some of the other
settings.
models out there. So privacy, if it's not an issue that you're on top of and you're dealing with now, you will soon because it's everywhere.
Absolutely. And then you add on data breaches, and people realize how important the privacy stuff is. But we've given up our privacy to a great extent. Every website you go to, where they should, they will ask you, do you accept our terms? Read the terms. They're really amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, keeping moving along. Another thing that they were very interested in and they implemented as a corrective action were file analytics for file shares. And basically what that does, and I've mentioned this before, this ROT idea, redundant, obsolete, and trivial information, you don't want to save everything that's out there. All right. So what the file analytics will go and do will look at the external to your records management system content. So in this particular case, they had all these file shares, and you have something to go out to the file shares and find duplicates, even do some auto-categorization, determine whether it's just it's redundant or it's obsolete. It's been sitting out there for 25 years. Do I really need to keep this? And then really trivial stuff. We're having a car wash next Wednesday. Do you need to keep that as a record? No. And so what you want to do is apply this even before you get the content into the records management solution. Then we did something called a defined list of PRN, probable non-records. You may or may not have heard of this. What it does typically is, let's say for email, it's very applicable to email. There's thousands of email addresses that have nothing to do with anything you do in your organization. And by compiling this list, which is a little tedious, but there are known lists of this, like if you're going to, cruises.com, or it goes to cbdoil.com. I mean, these are kinds of things, they're probably not part of your business or your organization. And so when you make up these lists of probable non-records, you can eliminate a lot of content very, very quickly. And that's part of kind of this auto categorization capability. Establish rules for capstone. If you're not typically in the federal government, capstone is applied to the top level executives in the organization, because capstone individuals, based on the NARA rules, is applied to individuals that are in senior management. And it's applied because they want to keep their content as permanent rather than all the other little people who are running around supporting it. They're not as important, so maybe we'll save their stuff for 7 years or 3 years and so on. So they needed to do that for the executives in this small organization. Define rules for auto-categorization of general e-content. That goes along with the probable non-record, but this even goes a little bit deeper because it's looking at the content and saying, okay, if this is what the system interprets when doing auto-categorization and it's meaningless information, just get rid of it. Don't even consider it, and we should be good to go. Is it perfect? No, but nobody else is going to go and look at all this stuff. Implement a DoD, talked about that before, and the various chapters in the DoD, and so that's what we did with this particular customer. Okay, so the resolution of all this, we automated records categorization using structured metadata and full text. So we did the combination. It could be in an email to, from, subject, as well as the content in the body of the email and the body or the thread of the email. Then it also took attachments. It took, if you had an embedded fax, it can take that and do OCR on it. So we wanted to get down to the crux of what the content in that email was to make a real decision in terms of categorization. So when we did this with them, we achieved 40% reduction in particularly emails that were considered probable non-records. That's a lot. That's a lot of emails. If you go into a real big organization where you get 1 million emails a day, you get rid of 40% of that. You're reducing storage. You're reducing the processing of getting the full text out of them. A lot of those types of things are important because in the large organization, I know we're talking small today, but in a large organization, it becomes a bottleneck to have that much content that's not important to the organization. So achieving 40% through automation was a great win for this customer. Full access audit trail, and the result of that was identified an internal bandit breach. So there was somebody in this organization after it was implemented that was looking at content that they should not have, senior management's content. And the customer didn't know, well, how did they get to it? What did they look at? Because at some point they needed to approach that particular customer. Now, they turned on certain controls to be able to register the activity of this individual. If we would have implemented, and we didn't have it at the time, what we call threat watch management, then what we could have done is said, this person's looking at things they're not supposed to look at, or they're looking at too many things. The person had the permissions to look at this stuff because she was the administrator of the system, okay? But there needed to be a secondary control that said, okay, they're looking at too many records outside the normal number of records they look at on a daily basis. So they're either doing legitimate research or they're trying to, get into the system and look at things that they shouldn't. So this was important to them, and it really paid off when we could produce that audit trail. Cloud implementation. So our stuff, the FICE stuff product, was implemented in the Amazon cloud, but they had, as I mentioned before, they had Azure with the 365, which was doing the email and their Word documents and SharePoint and other things. And so there is this ability to link different cloud implementations. Okay, created dynamic dashboards and static reports for complaints and records. We talked about that, so they know, just by looking at the screen, how everything is going in the system in terms of how many records are being saved, what's being put on hold, how many are being ingested at any point in time, and who's looking at what records and who owns what records. So that's something that was a great improvement over what was taking place earlier. Implemented enterprise document management, feeding records management. They didn't really have a true records management system or document management system at that point. They were looking at SharePoint, but the implementation of this really gave them that smooth integration from their general day-to-day document creation to managing it as a record. And then they actually received the NAR recognition as a top records management implementation in the federal government. So they did a lot of right stuff. I must admit that the records management manager person there who's doing everything else under the sun really knew her stuff, and she knew what she wanted, and it was very helpful in terms of that. And that's what it needs. You need a strong person records management environment because, again, you're getting a lot of resistance from everybody else who really doesn't want to spend the time with it. Okay, so consciousness checklist. So last class, we talked about an introspective look at your contributions as records manager to your organization's records management program. So this week, we're doing, have I sought out external sources to help me improve the records management program? Again, This is an introspective look into yourself in terms of what you're doing to manage your records management environment. So for this week, we have a bunch of them. Have I reviewed online content from different organizations to understand my industry better, to learn something new? There's a tremendous amount of content. I don't dream this stuff up all in my head. Okay, they're just I think they're nightmares, as I said earlier. But I do a lot of research, okay, because I don't get exposed to all of this. And so the research that I do is the same research that you can do to understand better how you can basically implement these solutions and not have to experience the stumbling blocks that a lot of people when you're just trying to do this by the seat of your pants. So there's a lot of organizations that are very willing to help you. Am I attending continuing education records program? Well, if you're in our class today, you are. Okay. And if you request the credits, continuing ed credits, you definitely are. Do I participate in webinars by vendors and records organizations? Yes, you do. Congratulations. Have I have I attending? No, I should have been, have I attended local ARMA NAGAR? ARMA is the Association for Records Management organizations, national. There's a lot of local ones. NAGARA looks more at archives, but there's other local chapter meetings by different organizations that are very, very helpful for just sharing different types of experiences with records management.
And I know that some of these chapter meetings they're opening up to being virtual ones. So if you can't attend in person, you can access them online as well and still be a part of that conversation.
But they don't get credits like they do here.
Exactly.
And they cost money to join, but it's not too onerous. I mean, have I stayed up on changes in technology related to records management? I think this is a big part of the eyes. You can go to vendor sites. Most vendors have white papers and different types of things out there, but it's not harmful if you have the time or if the organization is not ready to take a look at any new technology. You can still invite vendors in. They're always happy to show you what they have. All right. And then not everybody buys. And we do this all the time. Part of the reason we run Records Management University is because we've had the experience of educating a lot of people who I wish they would have bought something from us. They didn't, but that's okay. It's a give and take. So talk to vendors. Have I been able to insert myself into the information governance circle? I've talked about this many, many times if you've participated in RMU, and it's very important. You need to be at that table. You need to understand how your information governance policies are created and who are the participants in that. Do I participate? Boy, I must have been asleep when I did this. Do I participate in vendor presentations of records management solution? Basically what I mentioned before. And then the last one. Am I addicted to RMU and can't wait for my fix every 2 weeks? Hopefully you are, and hopefully this is kind of like a fix, but it's not going to have the same exact effects.
Maybe for some.
For some, some people, hey, the endorphins may kick in. It's just as good, right?
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so let us help you help yourself. And so what I put together today was a list of what I would consider some records management hot buttons to consider. Do some research on your own. The eyes. Okay, privacy, as we mentioned. Again, very, very key. It's going to be very, very expensive for organizations to abide by either the GDPR, which is coming out of Europe. The initial big one in the United States is the California rules for privacy. And there's just, a lot of states are now adopting similar type of privacy rules. And the challenge is if you're, let's say, a California resident, but you're doing business outside California, it may be different than somebody who's outside of California, but you're doing business in California. They're very, very complex. I wouldn't worry about it right now in terms of deep diving all these rules, but just know it's coming. And what typically happens is that senior management knows they have to do this. They know they're very exposed on this subject. Um, and they come to you and they say, I need to know where all the private information is, the personally identifiable information, PII, business, BII. There's a bunch of these IIIs that, they think you can just go and do this because you have the records management solution. Ain't the case. And so you need to have some ammunition to say to them, I need 30 more people to be able to do this.
And just to kind of add on something that you said, Dean Mitch, California, yes, they're having that large privacy act that's coming through, but there's also about 13 other states
Right.
which are kind of following the same suit as California. So it's good to be familiar with this. I actually learned this at one of our local ARMA
Oh, okay, cool.
chapter meetings. So yeah, so it's good to know that these privacy issues are still coming.
And I find it quite interesting that the California and most of the ones in the United States don't require government to do it, whereas the GDPR, government agencies are under the same controls as commercial organizations.
Right.
So, but I think they're moving towards that. Okay, AI, artificial intelligence, another way of managing records more intelligently, uh, particularly if you have to have e-discovery and you want to look at documents that are similar to the documents that you first discover and say, find all the other documents like that. Artificial intelligence adds another layer to this, but it should be a very helpful layer as well in terms of interrogating and understanding the documents that are in your records repository. The cloud, we talked a little bit about it. Understand that more, understand whether your organization is heading in that direction. You may have a records management system here today, and the vendor is not moving into the cloud, but your organization in general is moving in that direction, something to consider. Another hot button is blockchain. I've talked about this. I'm not sure in RMU, I may have a couple semesters ago, but blockchain, look it up. It's an interesting concept in terms of privacy, in terms of managing records from a distributed point of view, so that not one system has all the records that potentially is exposed to a breach. File analytics, talked a little bit about that, assessing content before you move it into your records management system. It's really getting a lot of momentum right now because there's no reason to store stuff that you don't need to store. File syncing, having systems out there, whether it's SharePoint or file shares, where as content is created and the declaration that it's a record, whether you manually do that or just based on the content, will be sucked into your records management system without anybody doing any real activity. And then one of the most important ones that typically is forgotten by vendors, I would say, is this notion of effortless disposition. Disposition can be very demanding, especially in a larger organization where you have millions and millions of things that come up for disposition. And you don't want an individual to go through it. So there needs to be a kind of a sophisticated way of doing, a global view of it and saying, yeah, but I want to sample this amount of all these records that need to be disposed. Can I recategorize them? Is the system putting them on hold and not putting them in the disposition list? So disposition, as your electronic, in particular, record system grows, needs to be very efficient. Otherwise, you're not going to be very efficient. Okay, so that's kind of getting us to the end of the day here. And as we mentioned, every class, because there's new people on it, we do have the Fife Community site where everything records management is discussed. It's also the location that you go to if you cannot attend these live sessions, and you can download the links to the recorded sessions, as Chris mentioned at the beginning, and look at them at your leisure or review them a second or third time if you need to. And there's questions about or whatever, just post them at the site and we'll get to them as soon as we can. Okay, so we have some upcoming events. In fact, the rest of this week, I'm at our user conference in Philadelphia. Then we have the big ARMA National Convention down in Nashville. I think it's about a day and a half, but then you spend like 3 weeks in Nashville going to the different bars. I mean, that's the beauty of having it in Nashville. And I'm just going to go offline for one second, not offline, but off topic. But there's a great show on right now by Ken Burns on PBS about Nashville as its center, but it talks about hillbilly music, country western music, all that type of music that's been around forever. And it's a fascinating series. But the only reason he could put this together is what? All these records, and I don't mean phonograph records, all these records and the pictures and the archives, it's outstanding what they put together, and he always does this. And so if we didn't keep records, I tie everything back to records. If we didn't keep records, you couldn't do this.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really good. It's on PBS. It's playing now, and even if you don't really like country and western music, or you don't like hillbilly music, you know, you might afterwards.
Some feedback from our audience. They say they watched it and they thought it was excellent.
Good,
Yeah.
good. I'm mesmerized by anything Ken Burns does, whether it's on the Civil War, it's on baseball. He just has a knack for really presenting good stuff. Okay, and then we have Knowledge Management World, which is in Washington, D.C., more local, and that's a great show for learning, more about records management, content management, e-discovery. It covers the gamut of the life cycle, which is records management is part of that whole information life cycle. Okay, commercial break, 30 seconds. This is just representative because we always, we have people that don't know what FITE is or what FITE does. They know what Records Management University does. We're part of FITE Systems. I've been here 27 years, and because of what I've experienced with customers and individuals and records managers, this is the genesis of why we have Records Management University. And so this is just an example of what we've done. We just hit our 40th anniversary of the kinds of technologies that we have implemented on a singular platform. And kind of impressive, but without almost all these technologies, and I highlighted the ones that are directly related to records management, and I didn't highlight the ones like the cloud or e-discovery or workflow. They all work together to provide a comprehensive records management solution. Okay, so who's next on the couch? Class number 3. We need an integrated electronic and physical record solution. How is that going to work together? Okay, like I mentioned, the customer that we talked about today is really electronic. So many of you have probably maybe not heard of Herman Rorschach, but you've seen examples of Rorschach tests, and they're really kind of things left open for interpretation. And so we're going to talk about Mr. Herman in our next class. I think it'll be fun. Okay, so let's hear from the class. If you have any burning questions that you want to present to us, we'll try to get, I know we're a little bit over time, but those who want to stay, you're welcome to stay, obviously. And if we get some questions, that's great. We won't belabor it. We won't go too far into this. So we're here to put out the fire. And so let Chris know, and we'll give you a minute or two, or unless Chris has some questions already.
I have a question already. So one user says that they believe file analytics is sometimes part of a records management solution, or should it be more thought of as a separate tool? So do you recommend cleanup of content before it's migrated, or migrate it into the system and then use the power of the system to deal with it?
My belief is that you should clean it up before you move it. Okay. Certain organizations say, do not give me PII. Don't put it in my records, man. Clean it up before I get it. Now, email, you really don't do it. You ingest the email. So there you can do it as a secondary point. But most records management systems have the ability to find duplicates, have the ability to find PII through what's called regex. And so different aspects of what you do could be done as an external analytics approach, and certain things could be done inherently as an internal analytics. But my true belief is that if you can clean it up before you move it in and get rid of the dupes and get rid of all that, you're saving the records management processing a lot of time. Because what will happen is if you turn on the full text engine, right, that's doing all this recognition while it's coming in, and you get 3 and 4 and 27 different copies of the same thing, you're making your records management system focus, too heavily on that processing. And you have processors that have limits. So that's why I typically recommend it, because then you'll get one copy and it'll be the true record.
Okay. Uh, Following along that, would you recommend any file analytics tools?
There are certain ones, there are certain pricing on different ones. I know IBM has a huge one that very expensive. There's a company called ActiveNav that Fife works with um, that has a very, very good tool. But all these file analytics programs are not totally automatic. Okay, there is some work that needs to be done, because there's some determination when all this content is either, you may quarantine certain information and somebody needs to review it, or you may, do it on a monthly basis and say upload it now, upload it now, upload it now. So there is some interaction with them. But if you go to the web and you look at file analytics, it's not a big community of companies who do that. But like I said, ActiveNav is one of the foremost ones, and that's why we partnered with them. I know IBM and a couple other big vendors do have products in that arena.
And I think that kind of goes to your point that you made earlier: is have a conversation with
Yeah,
these vendors, invite them in, learn what their products do, and see if they're the right fit for your organization.
absolutely, absolutely. Um, I think we should wind it up. What do you think, Chris? Or we got?
Yeah. I think I tried to get to most folks' questions. If we did miss it, please post it in the community
Right.
forum, and we can continue the
Yeah,
conversation
because
there.
somebody smarter than me is probably going to answer. All right, great. So we are down to the last slide for this class. And as we mentioned before, the next one is the integration of electronic and physical records. This will be held on October 15th. It's not time to put on your Halloween costumes yet. We have another class before that.
It's time to think about it,
You
though.
can think about it. And I don't want anybody out there dressing like me and wearing a hat. But anyway, we always have fun. Hopefully, it was educational, entertaining, and enlightening. And we hope you will continue participating and participate in 2 weeks. Chris?
All right. As always, a fantastic audience. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and look forward to talking with you soon.